we talked a little bit about the emerging norms and conversations that are happening around companies' roles in the use of generative AI and free speech, what that looks like outside of a kind of legal context, but really focusing on kind of individual users and corporate roles. In our last panel today, we're going to be talking more about civil society's role in the ongoing conversation and debates around free expression and generative AI. For those of you just tuning in, my name is Jennifer Huddleston, and I'm a senior fellow in technology policy at the Cato Institute. And we have three wonderful members from three excellent civil society groups here to be part of today's conversation. And as I kick off this conversation to them each with an opening question, I am going to ask them to introduce themselves and tell us a little more about the group that they work with and how their group has engaged in conversations around AI and free speech. So starting that with that question, I'll start with Kate. Tell us a little bit about CDT and how you and your organization have engaged in these conversations.
Sure, absolutely. Thanks, Jennifer. So I am Kate Ruane. I am the director of CDT's Free Expression Project. That's us. Thank you all for being here. At CDT, CDT is a 30-year-old, over 30-year-old or like civil society organization that fights to protect civil rights and civil liberties in the development of technology, both in the courts through the filing of amicus briefs and through policy discussions, but we also talk directly to the companies themselves and attempt to the extent that we might have concerns about policy development and how it might affect the First Amendment or free expression, or to the extent that we might think that policy isn't moving fast enough to deal with particular issues that we see emerging at the pace of technology. We are also in active conversations with companies that will talk to us about their policies, how they are engaging in the design of their technologies, the use of their technologies in ways that attempt to both protect privacy and free expression while also mitigating some risks. And so that is the work that we do. And at the Free Expression Project, we have done it through talking to members of Congress and their staff, through filing amicus briefs in both the net choice cases and in the Murthy case this year, and in previous and in many other previous court cases. We just filed an amicus brief in a case called Doe versus Grindr in the Ninth Circuit. But we're also kind of actively talking to companies about not just what their content moderation policies are, but what are the technologies that they use to engage in it. And we do this both with generative AI companies and with social media companies. And we often endeavor to try to explain how some of these technologies are working through CDT reports, where we talk to a bunch of companies and say, how are you using large language models in order to moderate non-English languages? We do the study and then we put out a report that hopes to make it explainable to people that aren't necessarily in the policy conversation or don't necessarily have a computer science degree, which I don't. And so that's usually how CDT engages in these conversations.
Nadine?
Thank you all for sticking around in the afternoon. It is great to be with you. I'm Nadine Farid Johnson. I'm the inaugural policy director of the Knight First Amendment Institute at Columbia University. The Knight Institute has been around for about 8 years, and we are housed at Columbia and supported by both Columbia and the Knight Foundation. Our work has, up until 6 months ago, been largely focused in litigation, public education, and research, and then we added this policy program just at the start of the year. Our work is focused in free speech and the digital age. We looked to these different tools in terms of research, in terms of litigation, in terms of public education, and now in terms of policy. And we're really seeking to create space for regulation that aligns with and serves democratic values. It remains constitutional and furthers the opportunity for public discourse. So in the policy realm, we're actually, as I said, it's very new, but we're really looking at issues such as transparency, accountability, a safe harbor for researchers, for example, these ideas that there is a lot to be done to understanding what is happening. And that's why I'm so excited about this conversation in particular today, because we can look to these other pillars of, if you're looking at it as like a three-legged stool, the industry, the government, and civil society. I'm really talking about solutions here, and so I'm looking forward to this conversation.
And last but not least, Ash.
Thank you, Jennifer. This feels like the last vote on Survivor, where there are very few survivors left, so I appreciate all of you staying and hanging on. I'm with Stand Together. I'm on their constitutionally limited government team. Stand Together in general is a very big community of different organizations housed under it, and we have organizations that work on both different policy issues and also different types of engagement on those policy issues. We have an organization that does C4 work, right? Like that does the direct lobbying work. We have organizations that's very much focused on the civil society and supporting groups in the civil society on specific policy issues. And we have work supporting academics and their research centers. And we also ourselves produce research amongst many other things. We have a venture capital arm. Those are like the cool kids at the office. So yeah, it's a very big community of different organizations that are united under kind of the same principles of freedom of supporting freedom of expression, supporting civil liberties, amongst other things. And we've worked with most of the organizations in this room for decades now.
Can I add one thing that I think applies across the board to all three of us? We all generally take the position or point of view of the users of particular technologies in our advocacy. So, the companies are well staffed. They have lots of folks who can talk to lots of people. They have lawyers. They have all of those things. They don't need us to advocate on their behalf. And so we try to fill the role in the shoes of users who are often not represented in a lot of these conversations. And I just wanted to add that because I think all three of us do that in our work.
I really thought you were going to say we're women on the internet, and we've experienced.
Yeah.
No,
I mean, but also we're women on the internet, so we've experienced it all.
personally, barely.
I think I appreciate you guys doing your own introductions like that, because I think it's very important for this overall conversation to understand the experience you've had both as an organization and as an individual when it comes to interacting with these ideas, and how you view your own role and your organization's role in the kind of broader civil society context. Much like the last panel, while we will certainly discuss questions of the First Amendment and various questions of law, I want to kind of start with some of the questions that are more about norms and in some ways more about what can we take away from past experiences of civil society. And so to start with, what role do you each feel that civil society has when it comes to generative AI or AI in general in discussing issues related to free expression, and how do you view that as separate, or do you view that as separate from ongoing conversations around First Amendment jurisprudence? And I'll start with Ash.
All right, there are so many layers to this question. There's like 4 different layers. Let's start with civil society as a whole is playing a crucial role, especially right now in the AI policy space, because we are in this interesting semi-limbo moment where in the United States, very kind of fast moves have been made. Can't say the same about Europe, but let's just focus on the US for now. And a lot of people are looking for expertise and research and validation of what they want to do to civil society. I believe the first panel of the day has the staffers were saying that they do love engaging with the civil society, and they bring them, to testify, or they talk to them and ask for their expertise. So civil society is in this great position where actually, we haven't drawn the battle lines in the sand, and people are asking, decision makers and policymakers are asking questions. Now, having said that, there's also this thing of, we keep saying AI policy, and I think Haley on the first panel was saying, AI is not just generative AI, so many other things. Because of that, I feel like we don't even have enough talent in our civil society space to cover all the bases and all of these questions. A lot of the things that end up being covered, thankfully, so far, are things like free speech and AI, because we've all worked in the free speech space, and we're applying the same knowledge and expertise to this new area. And the same can be said about other civil society groups, right? So let's say the Brennan Center or ACLU, they have years of work they've done on civil liberties and the Fourth Amendment, and now they're applying that to government use of AI technologies or facial recognition. So we have some of that covered, but there's also this high-level question of AI policy where we definitely even today have had conversations about Skynet coming and taking us all. And there's also somewhat organized movement of extreme pessimists over the future and use of AI who just want to have a big red button to turn it off. I can bet they've never built anything. And then also just ban technology altogether, all the development from 2024 forward to be banned. And we also need talent and representation in that space to counter that narrative and not say that, all AI is safe and, this little robot butler that lives in your house is never going to kill you. I feel like robot butlers would be the next big thing. Anyone can take this idea. But instead to work on the transparency and safety with the government. I'm going to stop talking because there's just so many layers to it.
Nadine.
Sure. So I think this is a great question to start us off. I appreciate it. As I mentioned, I think if we're looking at civil society as being this, the third leg of the stool, I think of our role as being threefold. It's accountability, it's expertise, and it's influence, right? So civil society is what largely holds governments accountable, and our interest is in seeing democratic norms upheld, and in the case of our respective groups, we're doing that in the free speech or free expression realm much of the time, also including privacy and related issues. And then you mentioned we don't have enough experts, and I see what you're saying, but I also am grateful for the fact that there is such a wide swath of expertise within civil society, the subject matter expertise, the depth of insight, and the ability to draw upon so many different, from so many different groups and from so many different arenas, academia, et cetera, in order to help inform the work that we do. And I think we held, as is happening today, a very important convening function. And in terms of the jurisprudence, I do think that's really informative. In part because as I look at what we're building here at Knight, a lot of what I'm thinking about in terms of our policy solutions are based on what we've done in the litigation sphere and where we see a gap in the jurisprudence. We're trying to fill it via litigation, and there are also opportunities, I think, to fill it via policy solutions. And we'll probably get into more into this, but I will just say briefly, I think that our influence is critical, particularly when we work in coalition. I think that's highly, highly important. And as you noted, we work together, many groups. I actually think what you can learn from as we talk about AI is what didn't happen in the internet era, what we don't have yet, right? We don't have these foundational legislative solutions in terms of privacy, in terms of transparency, in terms of accountability, that I think would have been, and there's still time, right? Really, really informative to build upon. So I think that civil society also offers that perspective of saying we've been arguing for X, Y, and Z for all of this time. We still haven't achieved it. Here are some things that we think can be done now in order to kind of stem the flow and be able to write the course.
And Kate, any thoughts?
I don't think I have much to add on top of what my able co-panelists have already said. I would just say that, again, we stand in the shoes of average people, and we bring that perspective to the table, and we bring the perspective of defense and protection of their privacy and their free expression rights to the table where it might not otherwise be. And the other thing I think we bring, and this built on some of what Nadine was saying, is we bring a little bit of institutional memory into this conversation, where we have all of these new companies that have come onto the scene, and they have introduced new technologies that are exciting and also scary. And we run the risk of what Ben Weisner said earlier, which is scary, 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 regulate. And what civil society can do is come to the table and basically say, like, we were here for the advent of social media. We were here for the advent of the internet. Here is what happened then. Here is what you should have done but didn't do then, and maybe we could import that lesson into this process. And here's what you did do that you shouldn't have done back then, and maybe we can also import that lesson into this process, so that we're not just reacting, and instead we are thinking more precisely about some of the issues that are in front of us, having learned lessons from previous versions of this same-ish conversation.
I want to build on something you said, Kate, because you mentioned that you often view your role as kind of representing the average user, for lack of a better term, and not to put words in your mouth. But that civil society is in some ways really there to give a voice, perhaps, to individuals that might not otherwise feel empowered to have these conversations with these companies or with policymakers. So Ash, I'm going to start with you on this question again. Sorry, you're going first twice in a row here. But what are some of the ways that we either see civil society or individual users themselves able to have conversations and engage in conversations around questions related to free expression when it comes to generative AI or free expression online in general?
Well, the good thing is that we have learned from the battles and the battle scars we've had. So even when we engage in these conversations, we already are coming with the experience of, all right, this is what happens when you adjust the algorithm on this question, right? And this is what happens right before an election. This is how certain governments react, and this is how certain companies react to that. And then you take that and you go in and you engage. The good thing about these new companies, new kids on the block, is it seems at least that they don't want the repeat of kind of a techlash cycle. They are, if anything, sometimes too eager to be regulated, listen, I'm not in their shoes. I get it. You go into the European Parliament, it's shiny and the ceiling is high, and you're like, sure. But they need the validation from the civil society. So direct consultations and meetings and advocating that reaches those companies, I think, is crucial. Then collaborating with staffers and not lobbying at all, because I mean, there is, as the first panel was saying, there is a lot of bills on AI that exist, but none of them are actually moving, unless you're California. But on federal level, a lot of things are just kind of in this freeze zone, right, for the 2024 year. So this is a great time to engage with staff and to educate the staff and to let them educate us on how they see the legislative process in this space going. So that's another mode. And I think the third mode that I don't think we've said, is the litigation is already starting to happen, right, on some of these questions. Maybe it's still on district court levels, but the second it reaches circuit courts, civil society is going to be who starts filing amicus briefs and engaging and showing the voice of the user, showing the voice of certain principles being just expressed. So that's going to be the next step.
Nadine or Kate, any further thoughts on some of the ways we're seeing civil society start to engage when it comes to the development of norms as well as more formal policies?
Yeah, sure. I think that with AI specifically, CDT has stepped out in front with our AI governance lab. We brought in Miranda Bogan and Kevin Bankston to basically start explaining what these things are and what best practices are for designing these types of frontier models, so that we start creating shared understanding of what the technology even is, because I think that's been one of the bigger gaps in there's sort of a like AI is going to harm us all, AI is magic, AI is going to take over. And when you talk to Miranda and when you talk to Kevin, they have a much more grounded view of what the technology really is, and they can explain it, and they're helping us all understand. And that was definitely a role that civil society, I think, initially played in the beginning of the rush towards, or the explosion of social media, where a bunch of organizations got together and created the Santa Clara principles, basically saying, like, this is what we need from you. This is how you have to explain. This is how you should explain how your content moderation policies work. This is what you should disclose. Here are the ways that you should tell us that you consider human rights in how you engage, in how you create your content moderation policies and then enforce them. You need to have appealability. Like, we are moving towards like that sort of recommendation process again. I think where we're coming to understand what the technology is and how it works. We need to understand how people are using it, because right now we actually don't have any data on how people are actually using generative AI, for example. So we need that. But I think civil society is starting to come together and think through what are the recommendations we need to be bringing to the companies that are using various forms of this technology, and what do we need them to be telling us, so that we can actually have a meaningful conversation about how we protect human rights in the design and deployment of these technologies.
Yeah, I would just add, I think both of my co-panelists are exactly right. And I think the only thing to add is that part of this, that kind of, you want to call it like a translation function, perhaps, like it's the connective tissue that civil society provides that I think is absolutely critical. And allowing that opportunity for the discussion and the debate and the examination of what is actually happening, and be able to take that with recommendations and turning it also into policy recommendations that also could be used by lawmakers, by the administration, et cetera.
Kate, you brought up the Santa Clara principles as kind of an example of one of the ways we saw civil society engaging in the internet era. As we move into the AI era, there were a lot of things that the U.S. policy as well as civil society seem to, at least in my opinion, have gotten right in helping empower individuals and innovators to use the internet in ways that really gave a voice to people who had previously not had a voice, made the internet a very powerful tool for free expression, not only in the US, but around the world. As we start to look at civil society engaging in the AI era, what are some of the kind of best practices that were perhaps learned from engaging in the internet era? And is there anything that, for those who may have been a part of civil society during that debate, that are kind of lessons learned as well?
Yeah, I like to call this the "have you thought about this" question, where every time a company engages with someone in civil society, almost always the person that they engage with says, "Have you thought about this?" And the answer is, "Oh, actually, we haven't thought about it," or "We haven't thought about it that way," or "Yes, we have thought about it, but it's not quite a solvable problem yet, and here's why." And I think that that needs to keep happening with respect to generative AI, because one of my big concerns at this point is I'm not sure enough of that conversation is happening with some of the, there's very few companies that are offering frontier models that are becoming popular. And they are going to increasingly become how you access the internet, right? They are increasingly going to become what you talk to or what you search. They're going to become like a layer between you and information. And so to me, it's absolutely critical that we keep having these conversations with companies that are offering generative AI, because we need to be sure that all of the various points at which moderation can happen within these systems are considering equity issues, are considering language issues, are considering privacy issues, and are considering free expression issues. And I'm not sure that we're having enough of that conversation quite yet at every single level at which particularly a generative AI model might have to consider those particular questions.
Nadine or Ash?
I think that's a great point. And I think that one thing we can think about with that is that we actually know that business interests and human rights can coexist, is a thing that can happen. And as Kate pointed out, the Santa Clara process was a very strong example of that, and a lot of work that her organization and others are doing is furthering that model. And I mean, also like GNI, there's another industry, civil society overlap there where there is this discussion about how to bring these issues to the fore. I think in terms of all of the really important steps that you listed, I think it actually comes back in part to this fear, because we don't know what's out there, and the reaction can be, because we don't know, well, it's that drive to regulate, it's that drive to quote unquote do something in a way that ultimately could be detrimental, particularly to free expression concerns, and I think civil society has a really important role in seeking to mitigate.
There are two things that I feel like were great models in the do we call it techlash era? Do we call it the migraine era? From 2016 till this year, that were great, but I feel like they arrived at the scene too late, and the political battle lines were drawn, and they weren't really utilized. One of them is third-party bodies. So having third-party bodies that are not government, and they're not, let's say, like self-regulated, just industry bodies, but it's a third-party body that consists of civil society, academics, represents, everyone. It's kind of like a representation of a society at the place and time, and then has the industry. And together they work on, second part of the model is best practices that they try to implement and they try to have. And best practices has become this kind of punching bag, because often people will say it in a room as a get out of jail free card, because it doesn't have an enforcement mechanism if it's self-regulated. But if you have it as have best practices, but also have audits that third-party body can do, or have transparency mechanisms, reporting mechanisms, and implement them. And don't implement them, I'm sorry to be beating up on Europeans as I go to Europe tomorrow, please let me in, but don't implement them through European regulation. They have to be industry self-regulating themselves, but also being held responsible by the society. And since, again, this AI space is relatively new and no one is semi-mad at each other, we might be able to implement it.
So you mentioned that Ash, in your ending there, that in many ways this AI space is new and that people aren't mad at each other yet, implying to some degree that it's a yet, not a win. Yeah, not a long-term stable situation there. But at the same time, many of the debates that are starting to emerge around generative AI are debates we've seen civil society engaging in for quite a while. There are debates over free speech issues. There are people expressing concerns about the potential use of AI in mis and disinformation or in hate speech, or the idea that those programming these models may be engaging in heavy-handed content moderation in favor or against certain types of ideas. What role can civil society groups have in these debates as they apply to generative AI, and what role are civil society groups having in these debates in general right now? Nadine, I'll start with you.
Sure. I think it's important to actually draw upon the question we just had, which is the norms building, right? I think civil society is where these norms can develop in collaboration and to start to build that industry accountability that you're talking about, in addition to some potential policy work. But in terms of these debates, you're right. This is already it's many of the same issues that we've been talking about, and you mentioned that in your last panel as well. I thought was a really important discussion there. It's just that it's all in overdrive. right? It's the misinformation and disinformation. It's the malign influence, all of these things in a way that we maybe are not able to control in the same, not that we can control it anyway, but right, maybe not able to control it even less so. But I think the other part of this is that if you're looking at it from a policymaking standpoint, a lot of the concerns we've seen, these bills that have come up, these 100 and something bills, particularly the election-focused bills, a lot of these they're seeing a problem and they're trying to write it, but they're doing so in a way that ultimately could be quashing of speech, and that obviously raises several concerns. But the other part is that these technologies are going to have an influence even if they're not AI generated. So for example, there can be an idea that if someone says, oh, that wasn't me, that was AI, or that was something, then even when AI is not actually playing a role, it can be twisted and misused. And so what that says to me, there's actually a great Brookings Institute research paper about this, is that the effort of civil society in these debates is all the more important because you cannot legislate all this away. There has to be an understanding of what these norms are, how we're going to work together, and how we're going to develop a model for use that will be able to be built upon. Because as we've seen and as we've said, the internet era did not do what we needed it to do. And so we have an opportunity here to kind of correct that course.
So speaking of accountability, I hear a lot about mis and disinformation and election especially, and I hear the concern. But every time anybody comes out with the evidence, there isn't a ton of evidence that it's being used for that particular purpose. There is, however, a ton of evidence that image generators, for example, are being used to generate non-consensual intimate images. So I accept that as being a harm that generative AI is amplifying. It doesn't necessarily mean we need a policy specifically to address synthetic NCII, but I do think we should be talking about how to address the harm of NCII more generally. But when we talk about mis and disinformation and the use of, I think what I'm talking about when I say accountability is, first we need to know that this is a harm that we need to address and that it is somehow specific to the use of AI in its generation. Because if it is not specific to the use of AI, then we should be thinking about how we address the problem very differently. And I think that that's something that civil society can bring to the table because our interests and the interests that we represent are the interests of average people, of users of this technology who want to have it available to them, who want to be able to use it for whatever purpose. Like I could imagine a campaign wanting to use generative AI in a way that would free up the candidate for all kinds of other things, right? That might make a what would have been maybe a non-viable challenger, like primary challenger, into something viable. So those are things that we should really think about when we think about like reaching for regulation first because we're afraid. We should stop and think through the problem. Like maybe generative AI is being used to generate a bunch of mis and disinformation that we can prove is somehow harming elections. Let's answer that question first, I think, before reaching for regulation. And let's answer that question by, as Ash was saying, by talking to the companies about how, and finding out from the companies how their technology is being used, because right now we don't know. We really just don't have the data, and I'd like to have some of that in order to move forward. Researcher access to data in this particular realm has a long way to go.
Like a hologram in your living room of a presidential candidate might sound fun, might sound terrifying to you, depending. But, I bet campaigns would love to just be like, you can have a Biden in your living room and think that's a good idea. And then, but is it a deep fake? Maybe it's a good deep fake. So it's like
if it says something that he's already said,
yeah, like if they're the ones using it.
Like, what does it even regulate? If the hypothetical we have gone through is, what if you have a generated video of Donald Trump just saying his Truth Social posts?
That'd be so funny.
What is that? Is that materially deceptive, and in what way, and how does it harm anything? I don't really know.
Yeah. What was I had something to say to your question that I don't remember. Oh, yeah. So I think the focus here shouldn't be, so as we scale, right? AI is what it's doing to speech is it's just scaling it. As we scale the speech, the focus can never be on speech itself because we're going to run into the First Amendment head first. Happy Net Choice Decisions Week to us. But instead, we should be focusing on the systems behind that and the conduct of users who input into those systems. So if you're trying to regulate misinformation or like targeted disinformation campaigns, you shouldn't be trying to regulate the speech itself. Regulate the input, or regulate if the system is like created in a way that's on purpose, like if it's, there's malice in the system itself, then focus on the system.
Or look at the actors who are generating it, right? That's how campaign finance law works, right? Like that it is whether you fall into specific categories and then engage in specific types of speech.
So I kind of want to pick up a bit on this thread that has emerged. We oftentimes, when we're talking about civil society's role or companies' roles, are thinking about kind of what are the norms that need to be developed to stop a harm. But there are also a lot of beneficial uses of, you've mentioned this kind of idea of what if you could have your own personal presidential candidate bot in your living room that answers all your questions as opposed to the 1 hour debates or whatever. But one can also certainly imagine how that could be useful for an even more local level candidate. One can imagine a variety of impacts that AI could have on empowering individuals in their everyday lives to know just facts about the world around them or how they interact with different things. What role do each of you see for civil society, not only in perhaps helping develop norms around the harms, but also in helping to perhaps shift the conversation around AI to discuss the benefits as well?
I think that the foundational part of that is access to data. I think it's having researchers understand how these tools are being used, how they're being developed, and what those processes are, in order to help inform how users are actually reacting to them, and then what is happening with the users and with the user interaction. Because when we have that information, then can help civil society develop those norms, and looking at things whether they are for good or for ill. But I do think it's really important that as we think about this, I think there are some things we can agree on that, okay, these things are bad, for example, right? But I do think it's a question about how we make that determination, and who makes the determination, and who is bound by it, because that ultimately can lead to, that can disincentivize the sharing of information. It can disincentivize users from engaging, and ultimately, from a free expression standpoint, that could be dangerous.
We've seen a very long executive order on AI recently from the government. What I would love to see from the government is actually something that's probably much harder to implement, but that's educating from, middle school, from very early age, how to even live in this digital society that we exist in, because not everyone has caught up. We live in DC with, I feel like every other person has a graduate degree, and still people, fall victims to scams and sometimes question themselves. And I recently, the other day, I saw this song from Katy Perry that turned out to be a fake, but I thought it was real, but it was AI generated. We need to train a society and raise a new generation that questions and looks for sources and doesn't just kind of, consume all the content without thinking. And that's the only way we will ever catch up with the development of technology. Otherwise, we're always going to be in this kind of rat race and losing.
Yeah, I would say critical thinking skills. But I will say, in terms of teaching generation, I feel like my kids are always teaching me. Right? It's like you can't enlarge the paper, Mommy. It's a thing. Right?
We've heard time and time again today that AI is moving quickly, whether it's talking about AI and its own development, whether it's talking about the laws or the norms around AI. I was trying to look back, and I think the first thing I wrote about AI was around 2020, which makes me feel like a bit of an early adopter in some ways, given that the debate's really taken off in the last year or two. But given that AI is moving quickly, given that it often seems that these conversations are moving much more quickly, how has that impacted civil society's ability to engage? Is it something that's been helpful in terms of often these conversations are occurring perhaps earlier on, or is it something that's been more difficult because as soon as you finish the conversation, the technology has already moved on to the next application?
I mean, my CDT is very focused on AI, and even for us, it's hard to wrap our arms all the way around it. And I think that even we sometimes internally get a little bit lost in what AI is, because AI is marketing. And so there's I think what we're generally talking about throughout the course of today is generative AI, foundation models, frontier models that are general purpose and can basically talk to you. Sometimes accurately, sometimes inaccurately, but that it is these general purpose models. But AI is lots of other things too, and large language models, which are the predecessor or exactly the same as generative AI, depending. Those are really important in content moderation, right? And I think that one of the things that I try, self-discipline I try to put on myself is, not to use myself twice, is to think about what we're talking about in a particular moment. This conversation is about foundation models and generative AI that can do text, image, video, audio. But other conversations might be about large language models and their use as classifiers in social media, and what they're, and that to me other conversations might be about AI models that are intended to help you sort resumes for employment, or intended to help you, figure out who is eligible for a particular apartment. Those are highly concerning because those are civil rights related, right? So if we talk about it more, if we impose discipline on ourselves and talk about what we really mean when we say AI, I think that can often make the conversation more helpful, and it can often focus our minds as to what we're really trying to, or what the concerns really are that we are talking about, and how to address them. So for me, when we talk about LLMs and content moderation, I am worried about all things related to content moderation, and the fact that content moderation is in and of itself a numbers game, and then you apply a numbers game to a numbers game, and you're doing, you're getting a bunch of free expression concerns as a result. So let's be honest about that. Let's talk about it, and let's figure out how to deal with it, and let's figure out how to talk to each other about it. But with foundation models, you're dealing with something entirely different and much harder to wrap your brain around.
I wrote a paper about AI and copyright and the automatic, this AI, artificial intelligence offer in 2016. So I win. No, I got a B. It's fine. But I recently reread and I was like, wow, I should have stuck with this. I would have been one of the OGs. I feel like one of the things of the benefits of a civil society is that we, again, have grounded expertise in what we're already doing. Because everything now with policymakers has become, they just add the words AI to it. The Honest Ads Act now just has AI added to the front, and it's the same battle, but it's just AI flavored. So it's helpful that you kind of already know where to start in your analysis. I think there is benefit to that, but I feel like a lot of the pessimists that I've talked about in the beginning have a lot of funding and time on their hands, while we're kind of focusing on day-to-day things. And I'm hoping that in the next 6 months, between now and 2025, civil society is going to maybe have a breather. But when it comes to court battles, let's say in the speech space, when it comes to court battles, and focus and be able to actually produce long-form research and create meaningful coalitions and engage and create the ecosystem that we know and took us years to create in other spaces in the AI space.
also like AI to do what? Like AI to do what is the thing that like gets me, because we're always talking about AI. And it's like, okay, but for what? Because that informs what we can do with it or what our concerns are. And I think that talking about it as AI, as though it is a regulatory category in and of itself, can harm the discussion.
Right, absolutely. I mean, I think the other thing I've been thinking about actually is civil society being at the table and what that actually means, right? Because there are consultations with civil society. There were consultations with civil society with Leader Schumer's working group. But when we saw the roadmap that came out, those considerations were not fully realized or taken into account, right? As we've heard from multiple audiences. And so one of the things I have been thinking about is that it's not only about, yes, we're listening to civil society, but it's then what are we doing with it, and how can civil society play a better role in ensuring that what we're bringing to the table is being incorporated, is being thought about, and not as an afterthought, not as a nice to have, but as this is foundational to how we're going to be creating this policy going forward.
That's a really good point. And I would just add on to that, like, I think from CDT's perspective, we try to go, and I know both of you do this too, like we try to go constructively. Like, okay, we get what your goals are, so let's try and get them to the best place possible for protection of privacy and free expression, and making sure everybody can use this technology while mitigating the risks that we're concerned about. Like, how do we do that, and how do we engage in that conversation productively? I think that's a really important role for civil society.
Can I say my biggest fear is that we're going to do the same thing we did in kind of the past few years in other tech policy spaces. Might that be privacy? Might that be Section 230 debates, or just overall like speech debates, where we run around in circles and we try to get something done, and then we have, I don't know how many people from government are left here, but then we have government not being able to negotiate over the research and the data points we've given them and the policy positions we've given them. And then we are, best case scenario, stuck, right? Like, we still don't have privacy law, the federal privacy law, which, by the way, would be super helpful in these conversations around generative AI, because a lot of those conversations are about the data that gets fed into the systems, right? And meanwhile, you will probably have what we've seen happen in other spaces in tech policy. States go ahead and do this work for us, and often state legislators, like some of them are part-time, like some of them are, they have other real jobs. They don't even have staff, or they have one person who has to cover every single policy issue. Like, I don't know how they do that. They're underpaid, they're understaffed. And then they pass legislation, and like how it often happens with California, tech companies just start applying it across the country because it's easier for them to just comply. And that's what I would love to avoid.
So I'm going to ask our panel one more question, and then I'll turn it over for some audience questions, hopefully. It's come up a couple of times how broad the term AI is. And while we've tried to focus today on generative AI, even the term generative AI can be quite broad. It can be interacting with a very text-based interface. It can be something that generates video. It can be something that generates a still image. It can also be something that generates content specific within a certain field. So how are you or your organizations thinking about some of the different ways you might engage in generative AI depending on its nature, and what, if anything, has that meant in terms of perhaps interacting not only with other civil society groups, but perhaps with other subject matter experts? So, for example, the use of generative AI in health policy or in financial markets that can have huge benefits, but also comes with a learning curve for folks that have been in the tech space and now may see this in that area, or vice versa, people that have been working in a specific policy area that may now find themselves needing to be a little bit of a tech expert.
recently we did this at Stand Together where we have, as I mentioned in the beginning, a broad community that does a lot of different policy areas. We have a healthcare team, we have an education team. So what we did was we had a cross-functional working group that focused on creating AI policy, like vision that is across all of those policy areas, right? Like very high-level principles that are grounded in our overall principles we've had for decades. And then we applied them to like each specific policy area. So education or healthcare would be a great example. In education, we have great partners like the Khan Academy that has now created, they were actually one of the first people in this space, but like they have now created chatbots that are kind of individual tutors for the students when they don't have access to, you know, a human tutor. They have now worked around and are thinking about how do you change the exams and the workflow and writing assignments because now generative AI exists. And instead of, you know, kind of having the intense conversations about you can only like write in the like in an auditorium and you can't use the internet, so we make sure that you didn't use ChatGPT when you did this like 300-word essay or whatever. They're actually like, as educators, right? Like I don't have educator experience, like I teach, but like I'm not an educator. They ask these questions and they focus on what would be the best for the students. And so I feel like that's the best, and the same is being applied in other policy areas across our community, and I feel like that's like the best way to do it. I mean, selfishly.
Any other thoughts from the panel?
I'm happy to. So I guess my example of how we're sort of collaborating on generative AI now is we have a civic tech team at CDT that focuses on government use of AI and also, you know, the interaction of schools with artificial intelligence. And so in their work, artificially generated non-consensual intimate images is coming up a lot. And so, you know, both of us at the same time are having to get smart on this issue and having to think through, okay, what can we ask students, parents, and teachers about how they are experiencing generative AI in their lives, in the lives of students? What is it good for? What is it being used for? Do you think NCII is harmful? Is one question we're thinking about asking. Like, is this something that you even consider to be a harm? So that we can start gathering data about how it's actually playing out in like the educational context, and from there, hopefully we will be able to develop ideas and policies that could help educators with students, that can help students themselves understand this technology, what the risks are of it, what the benefits are of it, how to use it, how not to use it. And also maybe like go to the companies and say like, hey, like these are some of the best practices you could be implementing when you know when you are offering your service to be used in schools. Things like that I think are going to be critical because foundation models are general purpose and they're going to be used everywhere. So we're going to need to work with everybody in every other space, right?
So do we have any audience questions?
Hello again, my name is Juliet Adams, and civil society is one of my first loves. So I listened very keenly to what you had to say. Now, I am a member of the World Bank. We have a civil society policy forum, which we have a space at the World Bank annual meetings, which are held twice yearly, and we have civil society coming in from all around the world. One of the things that is very interesting is that many of these civil society groups, they have headquarters here in the US. So though it's the World Bank, the US has a lot of power and influence. You ladies on the stage, you have a tremendous amount of influence. And this is my challenge to you. The World Bank predicts in 2030, which according to math is 6 years, 60% of the poverty areas, the global poverty areas, are going to be in conflict violent conflict areas in the world. That's a serious problem, and that's why the World Bank is focusing on conflict and violence, though it's poverty alleviation and shared prosperity. So what about this? If you take AI, the positive aspects of AI, internationally, it's ironic, but it's true. The critical thinking skills that's so lacking in our US educational system, individuals are more open, their critical skills are higher. If you can present AI and how it can empower the society, and especially women. Women are very key in this conversation. And right now, when you look at AI, it's dominated by male conversation. It will take away jobs, the danger, the horrors. Focus on women and see how you can, through critical thinking skills, put AI in that positive way and bring a nuance to the conversation. Now, civil society in this country has become silent. It's a fact. I was geared with civil society. There was a time when Capitol Hill was like a second home. Anything happened, Capitol Hill, the streets of Washington was filled. Now you have a presidential debate in a matter of a few days to an empty room, and America is silent. So what I'm saying, let's take AI, move civil society. Civil society has to be enhanced. It's too quiet, way too quiet. And we don't need a Donald Trump to energize the US society. We're more than that. So let's get civil society up, and let's get real conversation and bring America back to where she truly belongs. What's your take? Thank you.
Well, as an immigrant, I'm going to start. I feel like I do have somewhat of a different perspective, having grown up and worked and lived in Russia before moving to the United States and becoming a free speech lawyer here. I think this is not a new, just like with other things we talked about in tech policy, this is not a new issue in AI, because we've had this debate and had to build from the scratch when it came to, well, actually social media and the way speech disseminates in Brazil versus United States before an election is slightly different, and the way, government interacts with it. And big tech companies had to figure out and build systems around that and ensure, there's that trade-off. Do you want to stay in the country and provide some free speech, but not all free speech to it, or fully pull out and only leave government? Like right now, the only social media that basically is not banned in Russia is the Russian social Facebook version. So it's that question of, how do you operate in other countries, and how do you translate the innovation? And you have to be very careful. But we also have, we're talking about World Bank, there is the UN Rapporteur on free speech. There are systems and civil society that exist that is thinking about these things. There's RightsCon conference that's happening in February. Actually, they moved it from South Korea to Taipei. That is going to be talking about these things, and it's going to be focusing, and not just, focusing on the, what's the new global, no, it's not global, they're going to focus on the global majority countries now. So thankfully we do have civil society in there, the systems are there, and I think they're going to ask each other these questions.
I would just add that right now, generative AI foundation models and many generative, even LLMs, for example, they're very English-based. We're currently doing, CDT is currently doing a study of low resource languages in LLMs and how content moderation can work when the language that is being moderated is low resource, meaning there's not enough text for an AI, to train an AI model with enough efficiency that it will reproduce the level of accuracy that you see in English. And so what you just said makes a lot of sense to me in that, we actually don't 100% need companies to be going to other countries. Open source, or like open sourcing these technologies could democratize the use of artificial intelligence and the spread of artificial intelligence in a way that creates more benefits and more values for people outside of the English-speaking world. I would love to see that. Because right now we don't, right now the focus is the development is so heavily in English language and other, highly resourced languages, and that creates some barriers for development in other countries and in other languages.
Yeah, I think those are great points. I would also add that I appreciate the challenge. I think it's an important statement that you made to us. I think it comes back in part to what I said at the outset in terms of where civil society can be here, right? It is the accountability and the expertise and the influence, but seeing that influence and growing it and recognizing that it's not within particular borders, I think is really critical. I appreciate what you said.
Next audience question.
Yeah, so what are the real divisive, I'm thinking especially in the US, issues on generative AI and free speech that has the potential to sort of polarize civil society? Like I'm thinking net choice cases, for instance. Like you have people claiming to be in favor of free speech and they violently disagree about the principles, and each side will claim a victory or defeat, but with very different reasons, and claim to be in favor of free speech. What has the potential to create the same types of clashes that will sort of be polarizing among civil society groups that claim to be in favor of the same broad principles of advancing free expression? Are there some, or are we sort of broadly all on the same page? Or does it just depend on what resonates within the culture wars of this country?
So are we all just holding hands and riding off to the sunset to say job well done and no more disagreements, or do you think there are fault lines starting to emerge in this?
I feel like if I say it 3 times, it will appear like Beetlejuice. I think one would be definitely around generative AI and elections. I think, fingers crossed, like there would be litigation, but it should be pretty clear cut over it, unless an agency steps in. I think that's one. I think a second one would be about what previous panel has talked about just liability, product liability, potentially Section 230 applying or not. We already are seeing some cracks, but at the same time, I feel like people are not going kind of like feral over it. Like, we're going to have disagreements, court is going to rule, we're just going to talk about it, there's going to be a couple of law review articles, everyone is going to move on, hopefully. Those are the 2 that I see, like, what do you think, guys?
I mean, I would say that it's going to fall along some similar lines that we've seen in the past. Like, some groups are going to be more open to certain kinds of regulation, and others are going to be are going to argue that regulation won't help, and instead we should trust the free market. For me, when I look at the proposed regulations, I tend to think that they're worded in such a way that they're very broad. But from my perspective, I think that there are some uses of certain types of artificial intelligence that could be very tightly regulated. Like if you are taking an AI system and you are using it to make decisions related to housing, employment, credit, or education, and someone's access to those things, and you're running the risk of doing that on the basis of their protected class status, be it race, sexual identity, sexual orientation, gender identity, or national origin. Those are all things that doctrine has historically viewed to be conduct. And so if you are using a particular type of computer system to help you engage in a particular conduct that creates high risk of discrimination on the basis of protected class status within those categories, I can absolutely see there being good reason to regulate those things. Government use of AI, also another place where you're creating really high risks of consequential decisions being made that can really alter somebody's lives. And I think that those are places where we might be able to find pretty broad agreement among civil society, depending on how we craft the statute. But right now I'm seeing things that are very broad and non-specific, and just like, we need to do something about AI. And those are the things that, like, you know, there are going to be those of us who are more open to regulation along those lines, and those of us who are simply not, and simply do not want to see industry regulation. We would rather see competition flourish.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. And I do think that worldviews will play a role, certainly. I mean, they already do. But really the question is the specificity, and if you're looking at the legislation, it's the government interest and how narrowly that is tailored from a free expression perspective. I do think Kate's absolutely right in terms of where there could be broad agreement. And I think a lot of it comes down to the government use cases as well, in terms of surveillance and the other issues that I think we could find broad agreement in civil society.
So if there's not another audience question, then I will take moderator's prerogative and ask one more that I have, which is, I know we've focused most of our conversation today on what's going on with civil society in the U.S. and the debate primarily at a U.S. federal level. There are, of course, a lot of actions that have been taken by various U.S. states. But there's also been a growing concern on various technology issues about a potential Brussels effect and the kind of international norms that may be developing or may be failing to develop in some cases around free expression, whether it's free expression in the internet or free expression in generative AI. How are you looking at this debate, not only here in the US, but at the kind of ways that civil society can play a role in engaging in the global debate around free expression?
It might be the fact that it's the last panel, but my first thought was, can we keep the crypto bros out of it? I feel like a lot of the crypto experts have moved into the AI space and have claimed it. And I think the role in the global dialogue that we should be playing should be bridging the divide role. In a lot of the conversations, even that are being had on Capitol Hill, they ground them in, oh, we have to outrun Russia, China, North Korea, Iran on AI, or, in the world. And I'm not a national security expert, and I guess I'm a girl from Russia, but I think the international cooperation is going to be incredibly important as we move into an era that we can't even predict how labor markets, how immigration, chains are going to change. So one of the probably repeated ideas is using the old systems we've created, all those international organizations in Geneva that have been like collecting dust for a few years, and having these conversations there, but bringing the advocates from each country. So, because I feel like, correct me if I'm wrong, in a lot of the past decades, we've had civil society that was very different. We had advocates in each country focusing on policy areas, and then we had kind of international experts that did their own thing. And I feel like bringing them together might be the best solution for us moving forward.
I think it comes back to norm setting, like you're talking about, and people can complain about the efficacy or otherwise or how the multilateral system that we have works or doesn't work. But I do think it's incredibly important to at least have that conversation and to have civil society be part of that discussion, because we do need to understand and learn from one another, and these borders that we have are in some ways quite artificial, and so we do need to be able to recognize, and it also matters in terms of industry and development. I think Kate's point about the very English and maybe even American-centric nature of some of these industry developments right now, that's going to change, and it cannot always, my personal opinion is that it would be detrimental to view it always through a lens of we have to beat X. It should be like, how can we establish these norms in a way that will be essentially future-proof?
The last thing I would add is the DSA is here. It is here, it is being implemented, it is, especially for the VLOPs and VLOSs, a gigantic, resource focus for them. It is going to have meaning, at least within Europe. The UK's online Safety Act, thank you, is also just about here. And Ofcom has been, doing its world tour worth of meetings with folks to try to ensure us all that they're not going to break encryption, and that it's all going to be okay because Ofcom is reasonable. But like the platforms, like especially the global platforms that are used in the most countries, they have to respond to these things. And so, what are to me, like CDT, since we have CDT Europe. It's like, well, what can we do? What can we do using our colleagues in Europe that would also maybe benefit us here? While like the researcher access to data provisions are very interesting. Could we maybe leverage that to have similar access to programs that to researcher access programs that are available in Europe? Could we leverage that to be available here so that we can get some of the information that we really want, we really need? Could we we should all be watching transparency reports coming out of Europe like a hawk and comparing them to what is then offered in the United States. Are we getting different kinds of information? Are they complying with Europe's law differently than they do voluntary compliance here in the United States? What does it look like? So that's information that's coming regardless. And we should all be, civil society should be watching it so that we can take what we learn from compliance with the DSA and try to apply what we learn that is good here to the degree we can, and also try to avoid the things that we see as being harmful or difficult to comply with or as harming free expression.
Well, thank you guys for joining me. As a closing thought, I get to ask you what I always love to ask on the last panel of the day, which is, what has been your biggest takeaway from today's event? And also, of course, where can people who are interested in learning more about your work on this issue find you online? So I'll go in the reverse order I went last time, so Ash gets to start.
Actually, I think what was very positive takeaway was that the staffers were saying that they care about what we think and they want to hear more from us. And it would be even better that if, two groups came to them who have never gotten along and have said, we have a compromise on an issue that we will rally our allies on. And that would be super helpful to them. So that was my biggest takeaway, is maybe let's spend the next 6 months figuring out compromises and working with each other. And wait, what was the second question?
Where can people find you online?
Oh, if you just Google my first name, no one else has it. Yeah, I don't know. Thank you, everyone. Wear sunscreen.
I think actually that did stand out to me as well. But an overarching matter, just being in the room and having a great audience, and also seeing that there are so many people who are really wanting to do the right thing here, and they recognize the moment in which we sit and that people want to move forward on it, I think has been really inspiring. And you can look up our institute and find me on knightcolumbia.org.
I agree with Ash's point. I found the insights into the staffers' thinking this morning very enlightening and very helpful. I would also say, I would add on to that, since it's duplicative, that if you haven't thought about something with respect to AI in the First Amendment yet, Professor Frolick probably has. I learned that today, and I'm grateful for it. And you can find me at cdt.org.
Well, thank you all for joining us this afternoon. If you could please join me in a round of applause to thank our panelists. And then I believe I'm turning it back over to Kate for some closing thoughts.
This is very brief. So again, I'm Kate Ruane, CDT's Free Expression Project Director. For those that don't know, CDT is the leading nonpartisan nonprofit organization fighting to advance civil rights and civil liberties in the digital age. In the Free Expression Project, we work to curtail government censorship and enable everyone to have access to information and to express themselves online. This is an exciting time for technology policy. Generative AI and other technological advancements create new opportunities for creativity, scientific advancement, and efficiency across modalities, industries, and platforms. These innovations also come with significant risks. However, as adoption increases, our efforts to mitigate those risks while protecting civil rights and civil liberties must increase as well. Today's discussion was part of that ongoing effort to center free expression in the development of policies that govern emerging technologies. We hope it was useful to you in your work, and we look forward to more conversations like these. And I'd like to thank the Future Free Speech Project for co-organizing this and for leading on all of this. Thank you so much, Jakob. This has been wonderful.